All right, welcome back everyone to the second episode of A Room for Improvement. On this episode, we're going to be looking at the art of figure to ground. So to pick up where we left off with your assignment that you had completed from the first episode, we want to see how we can use figure to ground to build up layers into a scene. And when we think about it, we want to tell stories in our photographs. We want there to be some dynamic and complexity. We're going to want to build things up as we move along. So what I'd like to do is look at what you should have discovered in your assignment. And if you didn't, you can go back and reshoot it with these ideas in mind. And I also want to explain a little bit about why I think it's useful to teach it this way. Because there is a little logic to leaving the assignment open-ended so that you guys come across ideas on your own that help fill in the gaps as you go along. Because it's different than, I think, straight training where you're just trained into a single concept. I want to give you a system that you can apply to things, to your own photographs, your own subject matter, and your own work in a way that's distinctly yours. So just to talk a second about why the discoveries in the learning process are important. This isn't something that's my own invention. It's something that really comes out of the apprentice system. It's based on the way that I learned things and the way that things have really been taught for centuries. And the main distinction is that in the apprentice system, one thing that's done is that apprentices are given tasks, and the tasks have a little missing element. And that little missing element, which is something that every apprentice figures out, is they want to be able to make that discovery on their own so that they really understand where the leaps forward come from. So that's why the assignments are set up the way that they are, and I'd like to look at what we would have discovered in the first assignment. So I'm going to show you guys two images, and when we think about figure to ground, in order for figure to ground to work successfully, we need to have the highest contrast in our subject. If there's an area of very high contrast that lands outside of the subject, it's going to draw all the attention away. And this is something that when photographers want to understand how the eye works inside of a frame, one of the things that really dominates a frame is the area of high contrast. And it's something, again, I really encourage people not to just take my word for it, but to test it. Because if you look at things like highway signs, street lights, things that need to communicate like really quickly, they tend to be very high contrast. And that's because no matter what's going on in the scene, busy New York, you can see the traffic light immediately. You can see the stop sign, you can see the exit sign. So with that in mind, that can be a strength in our picture, or it could pull attention away from our subject. So this picture I took in Matera in southern Italy. We were inside of a church. The church was dedicated to Archangel Michael. And the color associated with that is blue. So what I asked the woman who oversees the church, I asked her if she could turn off all the lights in the church. So that when she did that, we didn't have any of the artificial light inside. We just had the light that came through the stained glass. And this is something that you will find in almost any church that has stained glass. Anything that has a delicate colored light. It doesn't have to be a church, but you find them often in churches. What we see is that on the left-hand side of the frame, there are two windows, and the windows, which are the sources of the light, in this instance, they read really strongly. They're really powerful because it's a very dark wall behind it, and it's a really strong light that comes around in front of it. So my subject is actually the color. It's the color that lands on the wall. And it's really difficult to see that in its fullest quality with those bright spots on the side. So a lot of the pictures that we'll look at are taken for demonstration. People say, well, why would you take a bad photograph? The reason I'll take it is so that you can see, one, And then if we look at the next one, we can see what happens when those windows go away. And all the delicacy in the light really comes out because we don't have these two screaming bright lights on the left-hand side. So that's something that you should have found, is that if you were doing a light figure on a dark ground, if you had something on the outside of the picture around the edges that was really high contrast, if you had a white spot, a black spot, what it does is it takes away from the subject. So we want to get those things out, because remember, like we talked about before, in drawing we start with a blank sheet of paper. In photography we start with everything that's in front of the lens. So we have to be able to take the portions of it that we want in order to convey the idea that we're going for. So then the next image is a picture that I was working with a photographer in Florence at Santa Maria Novella Church, and what he wanted to do was he wanted to shoot the stained glass and the architecture inside of the church. So what we were trying to do is to look at, is it even possible? Because oftentimes I'll hear photographers say, I want to do this and I want to do that, and I want to do it inside of the same frame. So what we want to be able to determine is, like, is it going to work? You know, is any amount of post-production going to be able to help something that's really blown out or terribly underexposed? Because figure to ground deals with things that land in a parameter that they fit inside of the frame together. So what does that mean? Is that when we look at the architecture here, the staircase and the balustrade with the window, we can shoot one or the other. We can either blow out the window and shoot the balustrade, or we can shoot the balustrade and in near blackness and have the window with all the color of the stained glass. So before we get out the HDR manuals, the reason that I would say that we don't really want to just put together two things that are on opposite ends of the spectrum is that, one, it's going to look completely plastic when it's finished. And you're also going to spend more time doing post-production than you are actually shooting. So my approach to it, and it's not, you know, not everybody's going to have this approach, but I like to find scenes that work as is. So if I wanted to shoot this, if the church, you know, candlelit in the evening is going to have, you know, the setting sun and afternoon light filling this in, this shot's possible. You could shoot the architecture inside and what's going on outside, but at the time of day we were there, it wasn't possible. So that's another thing that we're going to look at more in lighting, but, you know, going into situations when the shot that you want is receiving favorable light. So very often with travel work, especially you go on vacation, you have 1 week, 2 weeks, you might have to go back to places a few times. In fact, there are places like Matera, for example, after 3 years of going there, then the shot really comes together. So it's the right subject, the right light, the right figure to ground, all of these things when they gel in one instance, that to me is when I feel like I really have a picture. And it's something that, you know, it really takes patience. It takes going back to the same place. It takes waking up early, staying out late, and really being able to find a situation that works well together.